I'll just say, some of you are on for the first time. So World History by a Jew is a lecture series started by myself, and there was a couple other guys from our synagogue, Alex Vayner and Rabbi Yael New, and it was a program the three of us started, but I have been the chief lecturer, you could say that, since we started a couple years ago. And I never did anything online, nor do I like speaking in front of a camera, but you know, COVID has forced a lot of changes upon all of us. So anyway, welcome to our third Zoom lecture, and let's get started. Well, as soon as my screen's ready to move forward, we'll get started. There we go. Okay, so this is actually a multi-part series, but this is a special edition. So if you look down here, we're actually doing number 6, and I've got, in order for the history to make sense, I've got to mix in a few of part 5, so you kind of have the background info before I move on to just specifically Exodus. So just know the first 10 or 15 minutes, it's going to be, well, I mix in some of the biblical aspects quickly, but just know for the first 10 or 15 minutes, it's going to be a little bit more of the history of Egypt, just to give you the proper amount of background info. As for the other lectures, 2 of them I have done on Zoom. That's 1 and 2 here. And if there's interest, I can do the other ones as well. This is the only one that has a former PowerPoint, but I have been using maps and photos and so forth when I don't have an actual former PowerPoint to go through. Okay. So in discussing the Exodus, there are a number of issues that makes it extremely difficult. So before we jump right in, I want to give you an idea of what we're up against here. Number 1 is circular logic. So circular logic is, okay, I've read this paragraph in the Torah or in the Bible, and I want to find the archaeology that makes this work. And I'm going to dedicate everything to making this work. And that's not the way it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be that you gather all your clues together, and then from there you get your theory. So what I want to do is work from the Exodus through the scientific method. Now, in a sense, it is a little bit circular, because I'm telling you tonight why the Exodus is workable as we know it. But you'll see that I'm gathering all the available pieces and put it into a coherent story. Now, lack of inscription. So we have a couple different avenues here that cause a problem in this category. Number 1, Egyptians do not ever create inscriptions when they lose. So let's say they're losing a war, then they win each battle a little bit closer to home, right? That's how an Egyptologist knows that the Egyptians are actually losing the war. Each single battle is a little bit closer to home than the last time, which is not the typical path of a victorious party. Number 2, I'm going to mute everything.
Can you move all the way over?
1 second.
Come all the way over to me.
All right. Okay, I just muted everyone again. If you need to unmute yourself, you can. I'm just trying to get rid of some background noise. Okay, the other issue with inscriptions is slaves don't typically leave inscriptions. They can leave graffiti, but they don't leave inscriptions, nor do other countries talk about slave revolts. So you're not going to have the Babylonians talk about a slave revolt in Egypt. That's just not the type of thing that's recorded in international affairs. Delta archaeology. So we're going to talk a lot about geography and where the Jews were, but Goshen is in the Delta, and you'll see, regardless of what source you use, the Semites or Jews or whatever terminology you want to use, we're populating mostly the Delta. So the Delta is very wet. So that's the problem with preservation is if something's dry all the time, it's preserved. If something's wet all the time, it's preserved. But Delta is this place that it's dry and then it's wet and then it's dry and then it's wet. Oh, and by the way, the channels keep moving, and what was in water today is now under sand, and this destroys any long-term evidence. papyrus. So it's great. You know, I've got another series on Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia, they write on cuneiform tablets. Usually you have the building burns down. It bakes the tablet. The tablet's great for thousands of years. Papyrus is just paper, as we all know. Paper disintegrates. Specifically, though, in the Delta, this is very important, there has never been a papyrus found. There is no surviving papyrus in Delta for any subject. So that tells you you're going up against an issue with records of the Egyptians that you would not have in Mesopotamia. Silting also is another issue because, and I kind of alluded to this before, but over time, a channel can silt up, which then they just pick up and leave a town, which can be good for preservation, but also could mean that it disappears under the sand somewhere and you don't know where it is. Building materials, when they're building temples or pyramids, that's great because that's out of stone. When they're building palaces or storehouses, like we'll talk about today, that's out of mud bricks, and mud bricks dissolve in water. Once again, you have the Delta, and even without water, mud bricks disintegrate, which is the reason, say, the ziggurats in Mesopotamia are in horrible shape versus the pyramids in Egypt, which are still look phenomenal. It's the difference between stone and mud brick. Also, the Egyptians, well, every society is guilty of this, but ancient societies would reuse building materials. So they may see an old palace and then take those stones or take those bricks and move them to a new location to rebuild something else. We have a lot of misinformation. Now researching Exodus is very difficult because for every one good point you may find, you get about 100 different sources that are absolute junk. And it makes any sort of biblical subject difficult to research due to all the misinformation. The worst is the TV experts. I picked out a couple to mention. One in dating. I'm going to talk about dating in a minute, but dating is very controversial, even for picking the date of the Exodus. But I'm going to cover this in a few minutes. So how are we going to solve all these issues? We're going to look at the history and take it step by step. Let's see, there we go. Okay, I want to start off with what's called the kernel of truth analysis. I did not make this up, but when looking at any sort of ancient material, what you want to do is look at the tales that are told of that time and see if you can find pieces of truth in that. So there's 3 different categories of a kernel of truth. The first one would be a general kernel of truth, and that is, the best example is Exodus, that all over Jewish writing, as long as our history goes, over and over again, we talk about that we were once in Egypt and we left Egypt. And someone can argue whether it was 10 people or 1 million people, or someone could argue whether we came directly from Egypt or if we were there for a temporary period of time. Whatever detail you want to argue, it's been told over and over again that we were once in Egypt and we left Egypt. So that would be a general kernel of truth, something that it's such a fundamental part of the religion, and it's something that's so logical and possible that it gives you a vague basis to work with. Let's talk about specific kernel. The specific kernel I picked here was that Moses married a Midianite wife. Why is that interesting? Well, the Midianites were rivals and enemies of the Jews. So it's a very odd detail that the leader of the Jews marries a woman from a rival people. It just doesn't make logical sense. Why would the leader of the Jews marry someone who's not only not Jewish, but not even friendly towards the Jews? And so something like this would be a specific kernel that maybe there's something to it. There's no other reason why it would be included in a story. And the third kernel of truth is sometimes the information is just right in front of you and you don't need to overanalyze it. You just need to use that as your baseline to move on. So a good example of that is the first sentence of Exodus, when it tells you that a new Pharaoh arose that was not Joseph. Okay. Now, I told you I wanted to cover some history, but first I want to give you a little bit of idea how these different analyses work. So I want to look at bricks. Now, in my lecture on the pyramids, we went into bricks in great detail. And if you look here, there's this little iceberg. So if you see that logo in one of my lectures, that iceberg tells you that there's a lot more to the story, in that even I have a lot more prepared to the story, but I don't want this thing to go on for 3 hours. So I'm going to give you the short version. And if you're interested in anything that you don't think I spent enough time on, these little icebergs, if you follow up with me afterwards, I'll send you some reading material. Okay, there is a lot to learn about mud bricks, and there is a lot to learn about from the sentences in the Torah telling us about the bricks. So you'll see here on the right, I have the key sentences highlighted, and then on the left, here's my main points I want to go over quickly. Again, some of you have already heard this before, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. Okay, the pyramids were made out of stone. The pyramids were built about 1,000 years before Ramesses the Great. These two facts, along with the distance, that you've got about well over 100 miles between Giza, where the pyramids are, and where the Jews were located. These three facts, but particularly more than anything else, the fact that the pyramids were made out of stone and not mud bricks, tells you that the Jews did not build the pyramids. We're off by 1,000 years. We're using completely different building materials here. So I just want to get over that detail. Just the fact that the Torah tells us the Jews were working with bricks, and we have this highlighted here, the Jews were working with bricks, and so that gives us over that initial hump. We do have records over who built the pyramids, and this was skilled labor for the craftsmanship of actually cutting these stones. For moving the stones, it was a corvée, it was a tax system by the Egyptians themselves. They did not use slave labor on a wide scale to build the pyramids. So what were the Jews building? Well, it tells us, right here, if you look at Exodus chapter 1, verse 11, the Jews were building storehouses for Pharaoh, namely in the cities of Pithom and Ramesses. And we're going to talk a lot about Pithom and Ramesses in just a bit. But right now, I want to focus on what they were making. So they were building store cities. Store cities means they were building basically warehouses. And what do you use bricks for? You use bricks for buildings that you either don't want to put enough money in, or buildings that are more comfortable to live in, right? So mud bricks are much cheaper than stone. So if you're just building these huge storehouses, and by the way, Ramesses has these big storehouses, and so does Pithom, but it's argued they came from a later date. Anyway, these big warehouses exist, and this is, and also I should just mention, palaces are also made from mud brick. They're not made from the more expensive stone. The reason being that mud brick stays cooler in the day and it stays warmer at night. So for the comfort of their feet, I guess, kings prefer to build their palaces with mud bricks. And they all know that their successors will build a new palace anyway. But temples and pyramids, you want out of stone because you want them to last. All right, then I want to mention just the ingredients because I have that here. If you look here at chapter 5, verse 7, you'll see that stubble, or straw, a lot of times you see it can be translated as straw or stubble to make the bricks. So this is the real deal. If you look here, these are some mud bricks that were made in modern times, but that's what it is. It's the alluvial soil from the Nile. It's the sand from the same area, and then also straw. Those are the three key ingredients. And just to mention real fast, the picture kind of obvious, but right here, what you're looking at are Semitic slaves actually making mud bricks. Doesn't mean they're Jews, but these are Semites making mud bricks. This picture is interesting as well because these are Semites working in a vineyard. They're making wine. And we always talk about building the palaces or the misnomer that we're building pyramids. If you look though on verse 14, it also says, and all kinds of labor in the fields. And here you have a picture of Semites. Both of these are from an actual tomb in Egypt. You have pictures of Semitic slaves working in the field. So good stuff, right? All right, now the dating controversy is about the most frustrating and difficult part of this lecture to research. And I've spun myself around and around and around. So what I'm going to do tonight is kind of give you a brief overview, but I'm not about to go through all the details. You'll see I have my little iceberg logo again. I do have a couple good articles on it if you want to know more, but dealing with the dates can be difficult to say the least. Now, let's look here. We've got a couple contradictory statements. If you look at Genesis chapter 15, it's telling us that the Jews were oppressed for 400 years, and then the fourth generation will then return to the land of Canaan. Now, this is already self-contradictory, because a fourth generation in 400 years, fourth generation, well, in modern times, we usually look at that as about 25 years per generation. Even so, whether you put 25 or 50 years, that's not 400 years. Second line I'll look at. Exodus chapter 12, verse 40, the Jews dwelled in Egypt for 430 years. All right, so then we've got to wait, here it says 400 and here it says 430. Well, here it actually didn't say they were there 400, so they were slaves for 400. This says they dwelled for 430. So this is just to give you a taste. This whole conversation is bullet point number 1 right here. So we are using the 210-year figure for how long the Jews were actually in Egypt. And this gives you the math. So the clock actually started when Isaac was born, because that was when Abraham's sojourning started, even though he wasn't quite in Egypt yet. But it continues his sojourning, and then Jacob's descent, or really Joseph, and then Jacob coming into Egypt. And then you can see here, it gives you the nice numbers that Jews were there for 124 years, slowly losing rights, and they were slaves the last 86 years. This all works out very nicely with this bottom corner. So if you look at the bottom right, this is Chabad's rabbinical timeline, and this is what I'm following for Jewish dates. But the basic calculation here is this 400 years. That was actually 210 in Egypt, and then this number 480 years since Exodus. So if you look here, the Beit HaMikdash, so that's the temple built by Solomon in 833 BCE, and that was, we're told in Kings that this was exactly 480 years after the Exodus. So that takes you back to 1313. I'm going to leave this subject. If you want to know more, let me know. But that's our dating dilemma. Now, I told you when I started, you had to give me about 10 minutes or so to do pure Egyptian history. So we're now entering that 10 minutes that I want to give you the background information you need to know to appreciate the rest of this lecture. So I know you're here for Exodus, but let me give you a little bit of info on Egyptian history, and then we'll have some fun with how it all plays out. So I'm starting with King Tut. King Tut has nothing to do with our Exodus story. You may occasionally read otherwise by some questionable sources, but King Tut has nothing to do with it. I just want him here because I know he's a recognizable base point for basically everyone. And if you look here on the left, I have the order of pharaohs. I did leave a couple very minor, short-lived pharaohs out, but this is everyone I talk about today in order. So you can see where we are on the list. This is King Tut. So King Tut dies in 1322 BCE due to questionable circumstances, but that's not for our lecture. That's another lecture I have. When King Tut dies, he's replaced by Ai. Ai was an administrator in his government who somehow was able to usurp the power. Ai obviously didn't serve very long, and when he died, he was replaced by Horemheb. And I realize most of these names are unfamiliar to you. That's fine. I'm just trying to get you to Ramesses. Okay, so Horemheb was a highly successful general, and when he got the job, not only was he a great general, but he was also a great administrator. And he created a number of reforms in his administration that stabilized the Egyptian government and really the country in general, and set it up for its future success. However, Horemheb had a weakness, and that was that he was already an older individual, older for that day, and he was probably in his 60s. I don't want to offend anyone, but he was probably in his 60s. That was an older time for him. He was past childbearing age, and he had no descendants to pass the kingship onto. So he realized, I'm telling you, the guy was a great leader. He realized that he had this problem and he wanted to fix it. So what he did was look at someone like himself. He wanted to find a very successful general but a general that had children, specifically had sons. So he identified a general who he considered probably the second best general, not a young guy, but probably the second best general. But this guy had a son who was already like a a mid-officer, like a captain or a major in the Egyptian army. And the son already had a toddler, a baby. So this son already had another son. So you have these three generations of males, with the two adult ones already successful army officers. So Horemheb tabbed, as his lasting gift to the Egyptian people, is he tabbed this general whose name was Paramassu. So Paramassu is now the new pharaoh, and Paramassu is going to start the new dynasty. So Horemheb ends the 18th dynasty, and we start the 19th dynasty. Now you're going to look at this list, and you're going to be like, well, where's Paramassu? When Paramassu became pharaoh, he changed his name to Ramesses. So you see, there's actually, you can see his mummy here. So this is Ramesses the First. This is not Ramesses the Great. We're going to get to Ramesses the Great in a minute. But so Ramesses the First, as I mentioned, he was already an older individual when he got the role. A lot of the reason he got the role was not just he was a great general, but his son was a good young officer. So after a couple years, Ramesses the First passes, and his son takes over. His son, who was that captain major type officer, is now the new pharaoh, and he is Seti the First. So Seti the First, he has a long enough reign, 10 plus years, that he's able to get Egypt back on a stable foot, considering we're starting a brand new dynasty here. It's always very dangerous in the ancient world when a family's dying out and a new royal family starts. So Seti was able to stabilize the family. He was a very successful general, and he had a number of campaigns, and it's not in the place tonight to go through each of his campaigns, but I want you to kind of look at his area of action, and that's what these two maps are for. So he was dealing with a couple other empires of the time. We have the Hittites, that's where Turkey is today, and then we have the Mitanni, which is kind of like northern Iraq, Syria, a little bit of Armenia. This area is Mitanni. Now, Seti and Mitanni, I'm sorry, Seti as the pharaoh of Egypt and Mitanni teamed up, and they actually pushed the Hittites back. So if you look at the second map, you'll see the Hittites are not as big as they are in the first map, and that's because the Egyptians and Mitannis had really teamed up and pushed them back. But the Hittites were waiting for the opening for revenge, and that's gonna take us to our next pharaoh. Now, when Seti the First died, if you remember, when he got the job, it was because his father was a successful general. He was the successful younger son, and then he had a son himself who was a toddler at the time. But this toddler was no longer a toddler. He was now a young man, and this young man is going to be Ramesses II, or as we know, Ramesses the Great. And Ramesses, by the way, there's a lot of alternative stories, but we're going to put the details together tonight, and you're going to see why Ramesses II is been identified over and over again as the pharaoh of the Exodus. All right, so let's look at some quick facts here about Ramesses the Great. He reigned 67 years. That's a tremendous period of time in any day and age, particularly in the ancient world. He was born in around 1300 BC. It's great. You can see his mummy here. The mummy is very well preserved. He's 5'6". Oh, and let me switch back to his. Look at the nose here. This aquiline nose. And then if I switch back to his father also has the same aquiline nose. I thought that's pretty cool. Anyway, so you'll see here that when they found the mummy, he has auburn hair, that's like a cool detail. Okay, you find the mummy, you know what his hair color is. But the guy, I mean, look how long he reigned. He was in his 80s when he died. How did they know he had auburn hair? I can only guess that he was dying, and I don't think he could put off the years that well. But so we're going to be talking a lot more about Ramesses. Let me move on to the next slide here. So this was the world to Ramesses, and he followed his father's tradition of repeated campaigns. And you can see from this map on the right how many campaigns he had into the same area. Now, those of you who've heard a few of my Egyptian lectures have heard this before, so please forgive my repetition. But Egyptians believed that Egypt was holy land, and they, as part of their religion, did not want to die outside of Egypt because it can affect them in the afterlife. So it was very hard for Egypt to hold an empire beyond the Egyptian border because their own soldiers did not want to stay there very long. And so because of that, really more than anything else, you see repeated invasions throughout history over and over and over again, because they may be able to take an area, but they have a hard time holding it after that. Okay, let's now I want to spend a minute looking at the cities that are relevant for the Exodus story. And you'll see, once again, I've highlighted the key verses. So if you look here at Genesis chapter 45, dwell in the land of Goshen. We get a repetition here, right? Chapter 9 of Exodus, dwell in the land of Goshen. The Goshen is this northeastern quadrant of the delta. All right, let me go back to this one. So we see where Avaris is actually another name for Pi Ramses. So just know that we're like really dealing with this section of the delta, and that's not controversial. I mean, someone may argue whether there were Jews there or not, but this was the area that Semites populated, and no one's going to argue with that, just because the proximity to the land of Canaan. Also, this area was better for shepherds, and of course, we know Egyptians did not like shepherds, but Semitic people were shepherds. So it all comes together. Now, I want to point out a few cities here. So once again, we're talking about Arpithom and Ramses. So I like this map because it's showing you where the city of Ramses is, right? And we see where the city of Pithom is. Both of these have been identified through archaeology. So Ramses is actually Pi Ramses, and Pithom is actually not Pithom, but Pi Atum. So that Pi, which is the same root as what's in Pharaoh, that P sound in the beginning just means it's like the house of, the place of. So Pi Ramses is the house of, or the place of Ramses, and Pithom, which is really Pi Atum, is the house of the god Atum. But anyway, I think it's great that these have been located, and there's another one as well that I'll point out, and that's Sukkot. And I don't mean the Jewish holiday. If you look here at Sukkot, there's not only is the ancient city been located, but also there's an Egyptian name for it, which is Zehu, and then even better in Arabic is Mashuka. So that ma, if you drop, which is the determinative, and just say shuka, that sounds a lot like sukkah. And so anyway, this city is not only listed here when we see the children of Israel journey from Ramses to Sukkot, but the city is known. So it's great when you have these landmarks that can be found through archaeology. There is another slide I chose not to use because I didn't want to bore y'all too much with the maps, but the route that you follow in the Exodus, and you can see a good part of it here. I actually have another map that keeps going all the way up into Canaan, and how many of the stops have been identified by archaeology. I don't think it's particularly important to our specific Exodus discussion tonight, but I will say, if you look, it's known through archaeology why the Jews did not follow the main road here, right, the Way of Horus. And that's because each of these cities have a significant Egyptian fort. So it makes logical sense. The Jews start coming up and they're like, oh, wow, I'm not going to go this whole way and one fort after another I have to fight through. I'm going to go around. So this city has been located. All the forts, or I shouldn't say all, but there's plenty of known forts that have been identified. So it makes sense they're not going to take the King's Highway when there's a more peaceful way around. All right, that's all I'm going to say about the route tonight. If you want to know more about it, I can send you a couple articles on it. Okay, now we're going to see where the story of Ramses the Great's history is going to meet the archaeology. And I'm going to talk about the Battle of Kadesh for a minute. Now, the Battle of Kadesh was the highlight in Ramses' head of his career as pharaoh, although he did it very early on. So only in his 5th year of his reign was the Battle of Kadesh. So this is the sequel to his father Seti. So I said before, Seti went in and he was fighting the Hittites and he was teaming up with the Mitanni people here. So the Hittites now are ready for their revenge. You can see that the map's gotten a lot more green for the Hittites since the last time we looked at it. And the two forces are going to face off in the town of Kadesh. Now, the Mitanni people are being pushed back from the Hittites, and they consider the Egyptians to be failing them because they're supposed to be allies, but they can't take on the new might of the Hittites. So Ramesses comes marching in to, it's really now Lebanon, to invade, and he charges through Lebanon, and he has 20,000 soldiers with him. And the story is important here. So he marches in with 20,000 soldiers. They're actually split into 4 armies. He's got 4 armies of 5,000, and he's kind of like a little 5th group where he's got himself and his elite guard. Well, he's marching in with one of his armies and his elite guard, and they find a couple spies, and they grab these 2 spies and they torture them, and they tell them that the Hittites are way far away. So Ramesses isn't worried about the spies, and he rushes in to the Hittite territory. But meanwhile, it's a trap. These are double agents. The army's coming. They find these other 2 spies, and they torture them and ask them what's going on. And they're like, "Ha, we're right over the curve from you. You're toast." And then it's almost like in a movie. The Hittites come pouring over the mountain or over the hills, and Ramesses' one army that's with him, that one army of 5,000, like takes off running. So what does Ramesses the Great do? This is why he's the great. He, with his elite guard, charges full steam ahead into this entire invading army. And he's able to hold them off long enough for his 2nd unit to get there. So the 2nd unit of 5,000. And then by that time, the Hittites have another army coming in. But at that time, the 3rd army of the Egyptians get there. And the day actually ends in a draw. There's a 2nd day of battle. The 2nd day of battle, things are going okay for the Egyptians, but and the Hittites actually approach them first to ask for peace. But at the end of the day, the 2 sides agree. They come to a truce, and they call off the rest of the battle. So the battle ends after 2 days. Now, that's the archaeological portion of the story. But when you go to Egypt, there's at least 10 inscriptions involving the Battle of Kadesh, and there's 4 major reliefs of the heroic Ramesses the Great, not only fighting off, but defeating the entire Hittite army by himself. So he came back and used this as a political coup, or should say a public relations coup, to say, you know, I single-handedly led to the defeat of the Hittites. And by the way, for a long time, Egyptologists believed that that the Egyptians did actually win the Battle of Kadesh. And it's only been in the last few decades that the truth's really come out, because the records from the Hittites have been found and more information has been gathered. And it really was a draw. But give Ramesses the Great credit. It seems that he really did lead this countercharge and saved his army. So he was proud of himself for it, and he made sure everyone knew he was proud of himself for it. So what does this have to do with our lecture? So now we're going to go through a little bit of analysis together. So I'm not just like feeding everything to you. Okay, this is more, we'll just call it circumstantial, but it's a nice picture. If you look here, this is one of the reliefs of Ramesses the Great fighting all the Hittites. You see the horse and rider are in the sea, and you see they're all drowning here. And you can look here with the line from Exodus, which is saying Pharaoh's horses came with his chariots and his horsemen into the sea, and a horse and its rider were cast into the sea. So this has a very visual element that we think of with Exodus. But what's the connection? This was the legend of Ramesses the Great's day. Like all the school kids after this, when they had to copy a story in school, they were copying the story of Ramesses the Great. The imagery of this battle was everywhere. So it was ingrained in anyone's head who lived in Egypt during this time. So now it's going to be more relevant when we look at our next ones. Okay, I want you to look at this relief carefully. We're going to zoom in on this in a minute. So this right here is Ramses the Great's army, and this right here is the camp. You can see the dead bodies here that couldn't get through the camp. But if you notice this barrier, these are like little shields that are all put together and they form a barrier wall. So this is his camp. Now I'm going to zoom in on this blue shaded area. Okay, so this is the blue shaded area that we just had. And here's a colorized version of it. Okay, just so it's a little bit clearer, I grabbed this colorized version. Now what I want you to compare it to is the tabernacle. So the tabernacle, or the Mishkan in Hebrew, is the tent synagogue that the Jews set up and traveled with. So this is not me. There's been two different archaeologists I've seen that have a pretty large write-up about this similarity. But if you look at the dimensions of Ramses' camp along with the tabernacle, they're exact same dimensions, exact same relative length and width. And then if you look at the reception tent, that's this, we're about to zoom in on this. But if you look at Ramses the Great's tent within his camp and compare that to the holy tent, the Holy of Holies inside the Mishkan, the dimensions once again are exactly the same. Now remember what I just said, this imagery is all over ancient Egypt. Now I've zoomed in again. So this is the tent that you see, and I know Matt Kerr loves that I worked in Indiana Jones into this presentation, but if you look here, this is the zoomed in tent of Ramses the Great. And then if you look, what is this, right? So you look here, and what is this? You have these two Horus eagles facing each other with their wings out, and there's a stone between them. And that looks a lot like the Ark of the Covenant, particularly the version that you see in Indiana Jones, which has to be the real version, right? Now, what's the stone in between them? Now, we think of the Ten Commandments being in here, but the Egyptians also show a stone, and that is this right here. This is a replica. So this is the cartouche of Ramses the Great. So this is Ramses the Great's name. So these worshipers are worshiping Ramses the Great's name in between the wings of these Horus birds. And you see here, here's the description of the cherubim that you see here from the Torah. So anyway, fun stuff. Does it prove anything? No, but it's definitely interesting. The imagery would be very unique. So that's what makes it stand out. It's almost like whoever was describing in the Torah how all the stuff got put together was trying to use an image that people of that day would understand. So they picked an image that was all over the place in Egypt. Okay, let's get back to our history. Let's talk about Ramses' family. Ramses was a family man. I know some may look at him as a bad guy. We're going to look at it just kind of a neutral party here to analyze the guy tonight. I'm not passing judgment at the moment. So Ramses was a family man. He loved his mother. How do you know that? There's actually more surviving statues for his mother than any other pharaoh built. So that's saying something right there. He also was really into his great wife, Nefertari. I should say that Egypt at the time didn't have queens. They had great wives. So if you were the top ranking wife, you were the great wife. Nefertari was his great wife. He did something special for her as well. He actually built her a temple, which was unheard of. So Nefertari got her own temple, which you can still visit today, that her husband Ramses built for her. She would die relatively young, which we'll come back to that. A couple other of the wives that I think are worth mentioning is first Isnoferet. Isnoferet is the mother. So she was never the great wife, but she was the mother, that's Merneptah, the mother of Ramses the Great successor. And we're going to talk a lot more about Merneptah later. So that's his mother. And then the other one I'll mention is Ma'at-Hor-Neferah. Ma'at-Hor-Neferah was the daughter of the Hittite king. So eventually, after supposedly this great victory, Ramses the Great signs a treaty with the Hittites. It doesn't seem there's any exchange of land, but as part of the treaty, he got this Hittite princess. So the reason I have her on there is she's really kind of our living embodiment of peace between the Egyptians and the Hittites. He had way too many sons to name. Because he reigned so long, he outlived his first 12 sons. The oldest one Amun-Herkhotep, I'm going to mention again in just one second, but he also died young. I'm going to mention that again in a second. And then we have Kamwasa. Now I like him, and the reason I like him is although he was a prince, although his father was the king of Egypt, his favorite title was chief archaeologist, and it shows the appreciation that the Egyptian people had for their past, that a prince of the pharaoh would be prouder of his title of chief archaeologist than his title of the prince. So as being a history buff, I got to like that guy. And then Merneptah, who we'll talk about a little more later, but he is a successor, and he was the 13th son. You may occasionally see 14th son. Some of this stuff is still, not 100%, but most people seem to think he was the 13th. Okay, Ramesses epilogue. And we're getting ready to get into a lot more of the Exodus study, but I want to give you this before we moved on for you to have in the back of your head. So we talked about his great wife Nefertari. We talked about his first son dying. They both died around year 20, as far as year 25 of his reign. And remember, he reigned for 67 years, so still fairly early in his reign. Both his wife and his son died, and firstborn son, and it seems that they died very close together. He also had this peace treaty of the Hittites. I mentioned his bride, his princess, Hittite princess. After these occurrences, there were no more foreign campaigns. So I showed you that map. Every year in his first few years, he's campaigning. Suddenly something happened after around his 20th year. He was a changed man. He was a man of peace. He was out his firstborn son, and he wasn't the same again after that. And you'll see here, he died in 1213 BCE, as the dates are, as the timeline I've chosen to use here. He was in his 80s. You can see from the mummy, he was suffering from severe arthritis and very painful dental issues. And it seems he died of old age. I mean, like I said, he's well into his 80s, but it doesn't look like there's any foul play from what's been analyzed. All right, now let's get back into our Exodus studies here. I want to look at etymology for a minute, and any of my regulars know I really like looking at etymology to figure things out. So I'm going to look at a few things that we can gather from Exodus and the Torah. So first of all, if you look at the bottom left here, Exodus chapter 1, when you deliver the Hebrew women and you see on the birth stool if it is a son, okay, this word birth stool is not actually what it says. So the highlighted here in the Hebrew, oops, should have done that. The highlighted here in the Hebrew is ha-banaim. So this is actually the two stones. So it's saying when you see on the two stones, if it is a son. Now that's a very interesting detail, because Egyptian society back then had a unique way of giving birth, and that is that women braced themselves on two stones when they gave birth. No other ancient society did this that we know of. And here you have an image of what I'm talking about here, but the women would brace themselves so they had space for giving birth. And there's just no way someone who hadn't been to Egypt would come up with a phrase like this. It's so unique to Egyptian society. A couple others that are along this similar vein. If you look at Exodus chapter 10, verse 1, harden the heart. And by the way, it's not hard to find the next two lines. I just grabbed the first two I saw. But this harden the heart and outstretched arm, harden the heart, outstretched arm, you see it over and over again. Those of us who just celebrated Passover heard it many times. Both of these phrases are not Canaanite. They're not Akkadian or Aramaean. They're not Mesopotamian. They are uniquely Egyptian phrases. So when someone's stubborn in ancient Egypt, they believe their heart hardened. That's an Egyptian phrase that's been translated into Hebrew. And remember, people thought that they thought with their heart, right? Because when you're excited or you're scared or whatever, you can feel your heart beating. So people back then thought you had some sort of cognitive abilities with your heart, and hardening your heart then makes sense when you're being stubborn, like you're not letting your heart beat. Outstretched arm is a similar thing. It's an imagery used by Egyptian kings, particularly in Ramesses' day, in the 18th, 19th dynasty, where you have this outstretched arm from the king would be protecting people. You did not have that same imagery in Mesopotamia. That wasn't a common phrase, but it was a very common phrase. And I wanted to pick up, I said I'd mention him one more time. This is Amun-Erkebshef. This is the firstborn son of Ramesses the Great. And you can look even at what his name means. Amun is with his strong, Amun is the Egyptian god. Amun is with his strong arm. So even in the very name of Ramesses the Great's firstborn son, you see this imagery. Let me talk about Yam Suf. And really, I probably should have had the little iceberg logo on Yam Suf. There's a lot of reading material on this, but the going way of translating Yam Suf is Sea of Reeds. I know for a long time it was the Red Sea, but the going rate is Sea of Reeds. And by the way, all the translations that I have in my house now say Sea of Reeds. So this would be Chabad's Gutnik, Chumash. This would be translation on Chabad.org. This would be the Stone Chumash, and also the JPS. They all say Sea of Reeds. Now, where did this Yam Suf become Sea of Reeds? What's the connection? So if you look at the etymology of it, the word in Egyptian is not actually Suf, it's Thuf. So Thuf in ancient Egyptian means reed. All right, so Yam means sea. In Hebrew, Yam means sea, but Thuf would be reed. So we're saying Suf. Well, why is that? Well, it got corrupted when you moved to Hebrew. Just like my name is Seth, and I married an Israeli, my Israeli family cannot say Seth because there's a TH in my name. They all call me Set. So in the beginning of a word, instead of the ta sound, you get the s sound. So Yam Thuf is what it should have been, but it became Yam Suf, and that's where our Sea of Reeds comes from. And the fifth and final one I want to mention on this slide, I know I shoved a lot on here, but what's in the name? So in Jewish tradition, and there's a couple different versions, but the most common way of describing where Moses' name came from, it's a derivative of being drawn out of the water, right? The Egyptian princess Batya drew him out of the water, took him out of the water, and that's where Moshe came from. Most Egyptologists, in fact, probably all of them, would not agree with that, and I tend to favor their definition. And the reason is, let me explain. Moshe, the Hebrew version of Moses, Moshe is actually the same root as these pharaohs' names. So Thutmose is born of the god Thoth. That's where the Thut comes from. I know we always see it written with these E's, but really it's Ramosha. Ramosha means born of the god Ra. Then you have Amun-Mosa. Amun-Mosa is born of the god Amun. You see where I'm going with this? So Moshe actually means born of. And I think it's highly symbolic of Judaism that here it is, Moshe, our great leader, is really born of blank. He's not attached to any of these Egyptian gods. He's his own man. He's only attached to Hashem. And I think the name is really telling us something that a lot of people miss that makes him unique, that he's not subservient to any of these Egyptian gods. He's his own guy, and he's going to lead his own people. Okay. This is another slide I put a bunch on, but it's got a lot of information for you, and I'm going to be on it for a minute. So the first I want to talk about this year 400 stele. So the year 400 stele is not talking about the Jews, and you'd be hard pressed to find any authority really say that, oh, this is talking about the Jews. So I don't want to convey that. But what's interesting is it is a stela that was erected during Ramesses the Great's rule, that is celebrating 400 years of Semites being in the Delta. Now, remember we were talking about the dating earlier. Exactly 400 years. It's celebrating 400 years of Semitic people being in the Delta. So that's amazing. When you add that to the equation, what else we have in this recipe. Now I want to look at the 4-room house. So I'm actually switching over here to the right side. So this is the Israelite 4-room house. This is nearly universally accepted as a house design unique to Israelites, not Canaanites, specifically Israelites. And so when you have archaeologists looking at a site, there's going to be 2 hints to them that you have Israelites there. Say they're excavating in what's now Israel. How do they know this is an Israeli village? There's going to be 2 hints. Number 1, there's going to be no pork bones. That's always a good hint. Number two, there's you're going to have this set up for the houses. It's very unique to Israelites. Well, it just so happens at the temple of Horemheb in Egypt, you have these 4-room houses. So this would, if it was during Horemheb, and by the way, this is some debate on the dating, but here it is, the temple that Horemheb is building. Remember, Horemheb is the one who gave us the Ramesses dynasty. So the Jews would have been slaves at that point. And to see Israelite homes beside the temple of Horemheb, where they would probably be working as slaves building it, is cool. But like I said, the dating is a little bit controversial. But still, these 4-room houses that are unique to Israel are definitely at the temple of Horemheb. Now I want to talk about the Apiru and Abiru. This is actually a gigantic topic, and it's part of another lecture. I have a lecture on Joseph coming into Egypt, and it's a big piece of that lecture. So like I did with the bricks, you're only going to get a small taste of that tonight, but I want to talk about the Apiru. So you're going to notice the similarities already between Hebrew and Habiru and Apiru. Now don't worry about the starting with an A. It's just because it's how you pronounce things. So Hebrew, if you looked at it with at that time, you had multiple gutturals in Hebrew and other ancient languages. So there was what we use an ayin for in Hebrew. Ayin used to have a very soft guttural. Like instead of ha, it would be like ah, and so having an A should not throw you off from the similarity between Apiru and Abiru and Hebrew. So who are these guys? So the Habiru, which are, by the way, they're in archaeology in Egypt, they're in archaeology in the land of Canaan, and they've been found all over Mesopotamia. In fact, I have this great map in the other lecture where it shows you all the locations that they've been recorded in, but it's all over the Middle East and Egypt. So these are wandering people. They are considered a lower class of society. They're definitely looked down upon. They are used for cheap labor. They're often captured by invading armies, and they're enslaved. They're not particularly looked upon in a positive light, but they're most active in the same area we're talking about, and their center is definitely the land of Canaan. So it makes them very interesting. Not only that, the records of them run from about 1800 BCE to 1200 BCE, which nails the same time period as the life of Abraham, the life of Abraham, all the way to Moshe and the Exodus. It's the exact same time period. So if you want to know more about that, you'll have to come for my Joseph lecture sometime. But I don't want to, we're going to move on here. I want to talk about Pharaoh's magicians. So Pharaoh's magicians, I don't have a picture for you. Instead, I just want you to quickly read these verses here. So you'll see in the beginning that when Moses and Aaron first came to Pharaoh and they have their bag of tricks, right? Aaron turned his staff into the snake, and then they turned the Nile into blood and this sort of thing. The magicians of Pharaoh followed right after, saying, oh, we can do that. We can do that. No big deal. We can do that. And then we get to the point where the plague with the boils, and then we reach a new stage. The magicians say, oh, we can't do that. We can't do that. So I want to talk about what this tells us. So first of all, the story about the Nile being turned red or the Nile being turned to blood has multiple instances in ancient Egypt of other tales. In fact, there's actually a lot of soot that sometimes builds up in the Nile, and it looks red just even on its own. So it's not hard for someone to imagine. But they have their own legends about blood in the Nile. What I want to get to is the fact that the Egyptians are saying these Egyptian magicians are saying they can't copy Moshe. Now, what's interesting about that is there's actually existing Egyptian magic books. Some of the instructional books for these magicians still exist. In fact, there's one in London at the British Museum. And when the Egyptians see something they need to do, they look up in the book and they tell the Pharaoh or whoever is telling them they need to do the trick that they can do it. But if they look up in the book and there's a trick not in the book, then they are supposed to honestly say, we can't do that. Just, it's not in the book. We can't do it. And that's great because that kind of goes along here with the plagues. Like at first, oh, this is a known thing. Nile into blood, big deal. We can turn the Nile red. But then you get to the harsher plagues and these throwing dust up and it becomes boils. Suddenly look in the book, like, oh wait, we can't do that. And it's a nice little detail that adds our story. The other archaeological discovery that I want to talk about is the Merneptah Stele, but we're going to talk about that at the end. That's more of our closing piece. Okay, let's talk about what happened. We're switching back to our Egyptian history here. Let's talk about what happened after Ramses the Great died. So his 13th son, Merneptah, becomes the new king, the new pharaoh. Now he was, you got to remember, his dad was pretty old. Merneptah was already in his 60s when he took over. He only reigned for 10 years, which still isn't a bad life in that point in human history. He had multiple campaigns, mainly in Libya, but he also had at least one campaign into the land of Canaan, and he left a wonderful record of that called the Merneptah Stele. So that's what I just mentioned. I want to talk about that at the end. That's a key point of any Exodus discussion when you talk about Egyptian archaeology. Now, Merneptah had a legitimate son, but he disappeared. We don't know what happened. Merneptah, after he passed away, it should have gone to his son. It didn't. Instead, it went to his half-brother. This is probably a half-brother that he wasn't too close to, Amun Moshe. Amun Moshe may have been the one responsible for Merneptah's son dying. We may never know. But anyway, he was a legitimate son of Pharaoh. He seized power, but he only ruled for a brief period of time. What I wanted to mention about Amun Moshe, that was his nickname. He actually signed documents Moshe, which is great. So there's actually the name Moshe in Egyptology as well. All right. After Amun Moshe passed away, we then get to a much more unstable period. You see on the top there, we had in 23 years, we had 4 different pharaohs. Now remember, Ramses the Great by himself reigned for 67 years. Now we're in this period, we have 4 pharaohs in 20-something years. The last ruler of the 19th dynasty was actually a queen. It was a woman. And again, queen didn't exist in ancient Egyptian. She would have taken the name Pharaoh. In fact, I have another lecture on this character. She's one of my favorite characters in Egyptian history. This is Hatshepsut. And Hatshepsut invented this title of Pharaoh to mask the fact that she was a woman. That's for another time. But anyway, the next female pharaoh here was Taurosret. But the fact that she was queen already tells you there's some instability. In fact, if you look here, her husband was Seti II, okay? And you can see he only ruled for a couple years, and it was hard for him to even take the throne. But you see there's a gap here, right? So you got between, he died in 1202, she took over in 1193. She was a regent for a number of different younger pharaohs. There was a lot of instability, and just the fact that she took the throne says a lot for her as a female, that she was able to take the throne, but she had a short reign. She only reigned for 2 years. And when she died, that was the end of the 19th dynasty. So after that, we're going to start the 20th dynasty. Now, if you read about Egyptian history, you're going to read on and see that there's a bunch more pharaohs. So you got another 10 pharaohs or so coming in the 20th dynasty, but none of them are direct descendants of Ramses the Great or Ramses the First. Although I should say Ramses the Third, even though he wasn't related, he did have a long, successful reign, like 30 years or so. But none of them compared to Ramses the Great. They were now kind of the golden age of ancient Egypt was now past. All right, this is the Merneptah Stele, and that's what I want to look at next. Now, the Merneptah Stele is very significant for 2 reasons. Number one, it is the earliest recorded mention of Israel in archaeology. This was first. Not only that, it's the only ancient mention, the only mention of Israel in ancient Egypt. So this came from Flinders Petrie, and for those of you who've been on my other lectures, you know he's my favorite Egyptologist. So Flinders Petrie knew when he was alive, as soon as he found this, in fact, he was quoted as saying, "This will be the discovery people remember me by. This will be my greatest discovery." And he was pretty much always right about everything. So he was right about this too. So this is what he's known best for. Let me give you a little bit of information here. So first of all, you can see the hieroglyphs. I actually added this extra image. It's not on the original, but I want you to see how it breaks down because it's important for the discussion. Let me read you it's actually, most of it is about the campaign in Libya. So I'm going to get down here where I'm talking about the campaign in the land of Kadesh. Excuse me, I need some water. Oh. Okay. It says, when we're talking about Canaan, Ashkelon is carried off, and Gezer is captured. Yonaam is made into non-existent. Israel is wasted, its seed is not. Now, I don't show it here, but trust me, when you look at the names for Ashkelon and the names for Gezer and Yonaam, all these have a little determinative, which gives, it's an extra identification in hieroglyphics. Cuneiform has it too, that if it's a, you know, if it's like a god, it'll be a star, or if it's a town, it'll have like a little castle looking thing in this sort. So when you reach Ashkelon and you reach Gezer and you reach Yonaam, each one of them has the little determinative icon that means that it's a town. But suddenly you get to the fourth one, you get to Israel, and this is your determinative. Now this right here, that determinative means a people. So this is, you don't pronounce it, it's just telling you what you're reading, and it means a people. So this is like stop the presses. It was like that big of a deal 100 years ago. They knew what they found when they found it. What you have is Merneptah, remember, was the successor of Ramesses the Great. Okay, this was somewhere in the next few decades after Ramesses the Great died. He fought a group of people called the Israelites. And I know he said he wiped them out, but that's all Egyptian, you know, every time the Egyptians are fight, they wipe everyone out. So that doesn't mean anything. But he's saying he fought a people, not a town. It's not a country yet. It's a people of Israel. And it's very soon after his father dies. So this hits the period of Israelites' wanderings, right? At the latest, it could be maybe where the judges have started. But you have a wandering people that have not established a permanent home yet. And so that's why this is such an earth-shattering discovery. Okay, now let's, I give you a lot of information. So let me summarize for you a few things. So we started off tonight with talking about the kernel of truth. So this is where we identify little pieces of our story that connect us with reality. Next, we talked about the bricks and the storehouses and how the Torah clearly tells us the Jews were making bricks and they were building storehouses, and archaeology has found that. Then we moved on to the geography. We talked about the main cities, Ramesses. We talked about Pithom. We talked about the route that the Jews took, that it was the logical route. It's the same way the archaeology has shown. It's the same way the Torah tells us they took. We have the imagery of Egypt, and that's what I meant by the Battle of Kadesh, where you have like this picture that was all over the place in Israel. And then we see the same type of imagery described in the Torah. We talked about the dating and the chronology. Let me just say in general, the chronology works. And whether the rabbis' dates and the Egyptologist dates are 50 years off, when you're talking about thousands of years, 50-year margin of error isn't too bad. The chronology is good. Even if the years are a few decades off. Let me talk about the etymology. So we talked about these uniquely Egyptian expressions that someone would not know about unless they actually had experience in Egypt. And then we talk about our archaeological discoveries, that we have the four-room house in Egypt. We have the Habiru, the Hebrew people. We talked about the magicians. I want to go back to a point I said earlier, and I'm going to close with a few thoughts. First off, let me remind you, somewhere around the 20th to 25th year of Ramesses the Great's reign, his great wife died, his firstborn son died. He signed a peace treaty with his mortal rivals, and he never fought a campaign again. He was a changed man somewhere around his 20th year. We have the Merneptah Stele that shows the next generation of leader, his son, and his son fighting Israelites. And this is what I really want to focus on, these three lines, because these are all facts to ponder. Okay, these are facts that you can see them. This isn't, I'm not going to say no one anywhere dispute them, but this is the majority train of thought. First of all, the Torah clearly states Jews helped build the city of Ramesses. Okay, it says it right there in writing. Even if you don't believe it, you can't deny that it says that. It definitely says that. Number two, Ramesses only existed, and I kind of brushed over this earlier. I wanted to say this at the end. Ramesses only existed for about 200 years. What happened around 1060 is because of the silting. You remember the very beginning I mentioned silting was a problem in the Delta. Because of silting, they actually had to pick up and move the city. So you have this period of time, it's frozen in time that Ramesses was at this place for like 200 years. And if the Jews were helping to build it, they would have had to have built it around the beginning, closer to 1280 BCE. Next, what we just talked about, the Merneptah Stele, that the people of Israel were in the land of Canaan. It says the people of Israel. It doesn't say the country. It doesn't say the town. It says the people of Israel, and it's been dated to about 1208 BCE. These three facts are absolutely amazing if you think about it. We're told the Jews were in Ramesses. We know when Ramesses existed. And by the way, Ramesses ceased to exist in 1060. So people saying that Jews just made everything up around 500 or 600 BCE, no one would know this town even existed back then. I mean, it's not going to be remembered 500 years later that this town was there. So this is absolutely amazing that we have these 200 years in time frozen. And then finally, we're able to, and you may argue 5 years left or right, but we're able to very closely date this Merneptah Stele, talking about the people of Israel. So this is really kind of your wow moment, all right? So with that, I just wanted to say that I can't truly prove that the Exodus happened. It's not my goal to prove that the Exodus happened, but my goal was to give you some material to think about, to see that it's not so hard to fathom that this really happened, that we really are basing the Torah on this kernel of truth. And the Jewish people did come out of Egypt to form their nation state. So with that, you are welcome to ask questions. If you like these lectures and want to see another one, historybyjew@gmail.com. I have an email address. We have an email I send out once a week to let you know whenever I'm talking, where and when, although it'll be on Zoom for a while. And you're happy, everyone on tonight is welcome to sign on and listen anytime. So do I have any questions? You may, by the way, I muted everyone, so you may need to unmute yourself before you talk.
Seth, I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.